Imagine the most opulent royal chamber human hands have ever conceived, now permeated by the acrid scent of molten metal and smouldering incense. Behind ornate doors plated in hammered gold, sounds utterly incongruous for a palace seep through thick tapestries. These are the noises that cause even seasoned royal guards to avert their gaze and press onward. Somewhere within these walls, creatures trained to heed royal commands are being rewarded with sustenance that recently drew breath. This is not a subterranean cell hewn beneath a fortress. This is the secluded domain of the Immortals dynasty, the vibrant core of ancient Persia. Here, the man who proclaimed himself King of Kings and the woman who shared his bed treated fellow human beings with the casual cruelty of a child toward insects, objects to be toyed with, dismantled, and discarded once the amusement faded. History paints Xerxes as a titan who marched against Greece, ruling under divine favor. That version, however, has been meticulously cleansed. It omits what transpired after Greece inflicted a humiliating defeat. When his grand expedition faltered and his legend crumbled, Xerxes ceased his outward gaze. He withdrew behind the ramparts of his own palace, constructing a private world where no whim was too dark and no desire could be denied. Within this personal realm, women were not individuals, servants were not people. They were mere accoutrements, diversions, disposable entities. And when his fixation landed upon the one target that should have been inviolable, the wife and daughter of his own brother, Mecistes, Xerxes did not falter. He attempted to mask the scandal with lavish gifts, veiled promises, and enforced silence. Yet his true action was to arm the most perilous individual in the empire, the woman who lay beside him each night, his queen, Amistra. Persian warriors annihilated their adversaries with bronze and fire, with thundering cavalry charges and towering siege engines. Amistra required none of these instruments. Her weapon was dread. She grasped a fundamental truth that eludes most rulers. To truly possess someone, one must not merely extinguish their life. One must deconstruct them, obliterate their visage, their form, their very essence, until the person before you is unrecognizable even to their kin. What we are about to traverse, moment by excruciating moment, is how one queen harnessed her husband's obsession with his niece, our tent, and transformed it into a torrent of brutality so extreme that an entire lineage was expunged from the annals of history. This is a saga of gilded halls stained crimson, of flesh treated as mere fabric to be cut and reshaped, of an empire consumed by rot from within, its venom originating from the very seat of power. Before we proceed further, please leave a comment indicating the city and country from which you are watching. And if narratives such as this resonate with you, hit the subscribe button so we can continue to bring these forgotten histories into the light. Xerxes returned from Greece as a deity struck by a physical blow. Merely a few seasons prior, he had commanded chains to lash the ocean, bridged 2 continents with artificial causeways, and marshaled a military force exceeding the population of most established civilizations. Then Salamis occurred. In the year 480 BC, his naval fleet was shattered. Greek battering rams ripped through Persian hulls while he observed from a golden seat elevated above the water, witnessing his entire mythos sink into oblivion. The man who departed Persia as a living god returned as something far more dangerous, a disgraced monarch wielding absolute authority with no outlet for his thwarted ambitions. On the surface, nothing appeared altered. The royal treasury continued to brim. Gold flowed from Egypt. Provisions streamed in from Babylon. Governors in far-flung provinces still prostrated themselves when his name was invoked. But within the palace corridors, the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. Courtiers who once vied to extol his brilliance now hastily changed the subject. When Greece was mentioned, Generals who had pledged swift victory suddenly discovered compelling reasons to avoid the royal presence. Greek emissaries traversed Susa with an assurance that would have been suicidal a mere 2 years prior. Xerxes could sense the foundations beneath him beginning to crack, yet there remained no new conquest capable of mending the damage inflicted at Salamis. Thus, he resorted to the universal recourse of broken rulers. He abandoned his outward focus and redirected his appetite for dominion inward, towards the sole dominion he could still command without question, his own palace. And within that palace, no one possessed dominion over their own bodies. Every attendant, every dancer, every eunuch drew breath at the king's whim. A mere gesture from him could signify a reward, a brutal punishment, or a silent vanishing that would never be questioned. The royal harem functioned as a meticulously designed apparatus, ensuring he never encountered a limitation. Women were selected, meticulously groomed, perfumed, and cycled through his chambers like commodities. If a new face was desired, advisors procured one. If his interest waned, the woman would disappear into some obscure wing of the palace. The unwritten decree was absolute. The king's desires were sacrosanct, and your very being was but raw material. There was, however, one man who had garnered genuine respect during the disastrous Greek campaign. His name was Mecistes, and he was Xerxes' own brother. Mecistes had voiced his dissent in war councils when others remained silent. He had challenged flawed strategies. He had attempted to temper the campaign's recklessness when everyone else was too intimidated to contradict a deified ruler. Xerxes had dismissed his concerns at the time, but he never forgot. Back in Persia, Mecistes held a position of considerable influence. He commanded rank, earned respect, and possessed deep connections within the court. Ostensibly, the brothers coexisted without discord. This tranquility, however, was ephemeral. The initial fissure appeared during a lavish royal banquet, one of those ostentatious feasts designed to obliterate the memory of defeat through sheer excess. Tables groaned under the weight of food. Incense, imported from afar, perfumed the air. Musicians played until their hands were numb. Xerxes reclined on his elevated couch, encircled by nobles and advisors. The women of the royal household were segregated in a separate area. Yet, at gatherings of this magnitude, the usual divisions blurred. Faces became discernible, voices carried. It was at this juncture that Xerxes noticed her, the wife of Mecistes. Herodotus, the historian, never records her name, and this silence speaks volumes about her significance to the men chronicling history. An unnamed woman at the epicenter of a cataclysm. She did not draw attention through opulent jewelry or revealing attire. What distinguished her from every other individual in that hall was something far more unsettling to a man like Xerxes: her composure. She navigated a court constructed on performance and fear with a self-possession that bordered on defiance. She did not flinch when the king's gaze fell upon her. She did not instinctively lower her eyes. In a room filled with individuals rehearsing submission as a survival tactic, she appeared to belong to herself. To Xerxes, this was unbearable. He had grown accustomed to observing people crumble under his attention. Basic human dignity in a woman, no less, registered in his mind as a provocation. Desire rapidly transmuted into obsession. He did not merely covet her physicality, he craved proof that nothing within his empire lay beyond his grasp. He whispered to a trusted eunuch. He dispatched elaborate gifts. He orchestrated clandestine encounters disguised as familial courtesies. She rebuffed him, not tentatively, not with a subtle deflection that left the door ajar, but with a complete and unreserved rejection. She was married to his brother. She would not become his clandestine conquest. No treasure, no title, no veiled threat could sway her. In any conventional court, refusing a powerful man carried inherent risk. In the court of a king who claimed divine sanction from Ahura Mazda himself, it was tantamount to a death sentence. Individuals had been destroyed for far lesser acts of insubordination. Yet Xerxes hesitated. He possessed the power to enforce his will. No guard would have intervened, no court would have held him accountable. However, he understood the complex calculus involved. Mecistes was not a disposable courtier. He was family, and he was influential. Publicly humiliating him by appropriating his wife could ignite a rebellion that a post-Salamis empire could ill afford. The Persian aristocracy was already murmuring about perceived weakness. Undermining the final pillar of familial loyalty could precipitate the collapse of the entire edifice. Consequently, Xerxes withdrew his attention from the mother and directed his gaze downward to the next generation, her daughter. Her name was Artent. Younger, less hardened, she had been raised in an environment where the king's favor was the most potent currency. A single indication from the throne could elevate an unknown individual to prominence overnight. She was the daughter of Mecistes, a lineage that rendered her both protected and vulnerable. The very familial bonds that safeguarded her father now made her a valuable asset to Xerxes in an entirely different capacity. Engaging with the wife would ignite a conflagration, but the daughter, that boundary remained perilous and forbidden, yet considerably easier to obscure behind a facade of generosity and polite pretense. He approached her subtly at first, offering jewelry, fine textiles, and invitations to private gatherings framed as familial gestures of honor. He adopted the persona of an affectionate uncle. Then, incrementally, he eroded that boundary. Each gift carried an increased weight of expectation. Each kind word was underscored by the full authority of the throne. Initially, she might have perceived these overtures as innocuous, but refusing the King of Kings was not a simple decision. A negative response did not solely imperil her. It placed her father, her mother, and her entire household in jeopardy. Within such a palace, the concept of free will was non-existent. Power was the sole language. Under this crushing pressure, Artent succumbed, becoming his paramour. What began as a grotesque capitulation to royal obsession evolved into a sustained, illicit affair. For Xerxes, it served as a balm, a means to reclaim a sense of dominance after its erosion by the Greek campaign. For Artent, it was a gilded cage disguised as a benevolent offering. For Mecistes' wife, the woman who had defied the king and maintained her dignity, it was a slow-motion tragedy unfolding within her own family. And Queen Amistra observed it all. She occupied the apex of female status within the empire, the official queen, daughter of Otanes, bound to the king through marriage and the intricate web of political alliances. It is facile to cast her solely as a villain. However, consider her precarious position. She was surrounded by rivals, by concubines maneuvering for ascendancy, by foreign princesses dispatched as political tokens, and by younger women paraded through the court as if undergoing auditions. Any hint of weakness on her part could jeopardize her son's claims to succession. Her survival depended on her ability to decipher every subtle signal emanating from the palace, and the palace was a constant torrent of them. Servants exchanged whispers, eunuchs traded cryptic pronouncements, and guards meticulously logged arrivals and departures. Amestris missed nothing. She noticed the unfamiliar adornments gracing Artent's person. She observed a shift in the young woman's demeanor in public. A newfound confidence, a lingering smile, the unmistakable aura of someone who believed she possessed a secret advantage. In a court where a single glance could dramatically alter the balance of power, these were not trivial details. They were concrete evidence. Within Amestris's mind, a narrative began to solidify. She became convinced that Mecistes' wife, the composed and dignified woman who had always commanded respect, had deliberately ensnared her own daughter in the king's affections, not out of desperation, but as a calculated maneuver. By granting Xerxes access to our tent, this woman, Amistra surmised, intended to undermine the queen's standing, humiliate her publicly, and draw her family closer to the epicenter of power. This was the interpretation Amistra chose to embrace. Whether it was equitable or veracious was immaterial. Once she accepted this version of events, her target was irrevocably identified. Meanwhile, Xerxes descended further into his indulgence. During one of his clandestine encounters with our tent, he made a promise that only a man intoxicated by his own authority would utter. He swore an oath to grant her anything she desired, absolutely anything. He likely anticipated a request for something manageable, a provincial estate, a chest of gold, a title for her father, something he could bestow without consequence. He did not foresee her reaching for the very object that would detonate his household from within. Our tent requested Queen Amistra's robe. Not just any garment, but a robe that Amistra herself had meticulously woven. In a royal milieu where virtually everything was produced by legions of artisans and servants, a piece of clothing crafted personally by the queen carried profound symbolic weight. It was intimate. It was sacred. It was a testament to her not being merely decorative, but the central woman of the empire, the one whose hands shaped something no mere attendant could replicate. Xerxes went cold. Presenting that robe to his brother's daughter, his secret paramour, was not merely an affront. It was an explosive device aimed directly at his own marriage. He implored our tent to select something else. He offered her entire cities, vast vaults of treasure. She remained resolute. She reminded him of his sworn oath. The King of Kings had given his sacred word. Was he prepared to break it over a mere garment? In that crucial moment, Xerxes made a choice that revealed his true character. He prioritized preserving the illusion of his unbreakable word over his queen's dignity, the stability of his family, and the safety of the woman he claimed to desire. He procured the robe from Amistra. History offers no record of the explanation he provided her. Perhaps he fabricated a ceremony. Perhaps he remained silent. It was inconsequential. The robe departed the queen's possession and was bestowed upon our tent. The subsequent time the royal court convened in public, Amistra beheld it. Visualize that scene. A formal assembly, the empire's elite crammed into a gilded hall, guards stationed along the walls, attendants standing immobile. And there, amidst the women, stood our tent, proudly adorned in the queen's own hand-woven robe. Not concealed, not subtly draped, but displayed ostentatiously, like a flag planted on conquered territory. Every suspicion Amistra had ever harbored ignited in that singular moment. This was no misinterpretation. It was an act of war declared in silk. She did not falter. She did not erupt in anger. She did not grant the court the grim satisfaction of witnessing her unravel. That was not the modus operandi of someone like Amistra. She became unnervingly still. She observed. She meticulously catalogued every detail. She allowed the moment to pass with flawless composure, ensuring no one could accuse her of losing control. But behind that outward tranquility, a decision had been irrevocably made. Someone would be held accountable for this transgression, not through swift exile, nor a clean execution, but through a reckoning designed to ensure the entire empire remembered the cost of humiliating the queen. From that day forward, Amistra awaited a specific opportunity. In Persian royal custom, the king's birthday held a unique and binding significance. On that day, the king was expected to grant extraordinary privileges. Oaths sworn on his birthday were regarded as sacrosanct. To deny a request from a high-ranking individual on such an occasion was considered a violation of divine tradition. That birthday was Amistra's weapon. She could formulate a demand so horrific that Xerxes would be trapped between his public persona as a benevolent, divinely appointed ruler and the monstrous reality of her request. As the day approached, the palace buzzed with its customary anticipation. Courtiers rehearsed their petitions, provincial governors formulated their requests. Xerxes prepared to embody his favorite role, the magnanimous sovereign dispensing favors like a god among mortals. It was a performance designed to mask the insecure, scandal-ridden man beneath. He was utterly unaware that his wife had been counting down to this precise day, honing her request to a razor's edge. Before we step into that banquet hall and witness Amistra's seize her moment, pause for a brief instant. If you have followed this narrative to this point, you are not a casual observer. You are one of the rare individuals who genuinely seeks the complete, unvarnished account of events that transpired behind palace walls, rather than the sanitized paragraph found in a textbook. This membership makes investigations such as this one possible. Furthermore, you gain access to early releases before anyone else. If you feel you belong here, if you are the kind of person who needs to know what truly occurred, consider joining the lineage now. The link is provided below the video because what is about to unfold in that banquet hall will alter everything. The hall will be thronged, wine will flow freely. Xerxes will preside from his elevated position, prepared once more to embody the benevolent god-king. And then Amistress will rise. She will smile, and she will request a boon that will drag an innocent woman from safety into a nightmare of steel and gore. The hall will fall silent. The sacred law of the birthday oath will ensnare Xerxes like a trap, and with a single pronouncement, the King of Kings will consign a living human being to her destruction. The king's birthday was intended to be the most joyous occasion in the empire. Before the sun had fully ascended, the palace became a hive of activity. Servants moved swiftly through the corridors, carrying silver platters, freshly burning incense, and polished bronze mirrors. Musicians tested their strings and tuned their percussion instruments. Guards inspected their armor, then inspected it once more. Everyone understood the ancient protocol associated with this day. Xerxes would hold open court and dispense favors with the munificence of a deity, bestowing blessings upon the mortal realm. Pardons, promotions, land allocations, titles. Oaths uttered in that chamber on that day were considered almost divinely sanctioned. If the king publicly assented to a request during the birthday ceremony, retracting it later would be not merely embarrassing, it would be sacrilegious. Xerxes reveled in this tradition. It was the one day each year when he could feign ignorance of Greece's existence. He could occupy his raised dais and perform generosity, power, and adoration. Petitioners would form lines and prostrate themselves. Some pleaded for vast estates. Others implored clemency for condemned relatives. Governors sought relief from taxation or military commands. The entire proceeding was a meticulously staged display of royal benevolence. Yet, this year, concealed within the throng of hopeful supplicants, was someone who had not come to ask, but to claim. As the ceremony commenced, Xerxes appeared in his full ceremonial regalia. The hall teemed with nobles, military commanders, and members of the extended royal family. The air was heavy with the aroma of roasted meats, potent perfumes, and warm wine. From a raised platform adorned with silk draperies, the king took his seat. Beside him stood his closest kin, including Amistress. To observers on the periphery of the hall, the scene resembled a tableau of dynastic strength, the royal couple projecting an image of unity. Only a select few within that assembly could perceive the brewing storm hidden behind their composed expressions. Petitioners approached sequentially. Xerxes granted requests with practiced ease, perfectly embodying the role of the magnanimous sovereign. Laughter punctuated the crowd's murmurings at intervals. Cups were raised in toasts. However, Beneath all this pageantry, a procession was quietly advancing toward the moment that would fracture the dynasty in two. And then Amestris rose. Without a raised voice, without a dramatic gesture, she stepped forward with the measured control expected of the empire's highest-ranking woman. She began by publicly commending Xerxes. She extolled his wisdom, his strength, and his role as the empire's protector. Every utterance sounded like profound devotion. Every sentence was meticulously crafted to convey unwavering loyalty. No one in that hall could have suspected that each respectful phrase was merely the silken shroud concealing something lethal. And then she presented her petition. She did not ask for gold. She did not ask for territory. She sought no glittering gems, nor exalted ranks. Her demand of Xerxes was for the surrender of Misty's wife. A palpable hush descended, transforming the chamber into an unyielding tableau. This was no trifling request, no ordinary favor. Each word, meticulously chosen by the mistress, bore the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. On the surface, it could have been presented as a simple petition, a sovereign requesting a member of her court be assigned to her service, perhaps as a personal attendant. Yet every soul present in that grand hall, privy to the whispers that had permeated the palace, grasped the true implication. She was seeking retribution against the woman she held responsible for her profound humiliation. She was demanding the matriarch of the girl, now adorned in her former regalia. Xerxes recognized the predicament instantly. To deny his queen on her birthday, before the assembled court, would shatter the very illusion of divine benevolence that underpinned his reign. He would be exposed as a charlatan, a ruler proclaiming boundless authority, yet faltering when true consequence loomed. Conversely, to accede would mean delivering his own brother's spouse into the clutches of a woman whose animosity he himself had ignited. He hesitated, but only briefly. His ingrained pride dictated his response before his intellect could catch up. He uttered his assent. The pronouncement reverberated through the hall like a subterranean tremor. Attendants averted their gaze, fixating on the polished floor. Nobles stared resolutely ahead, as if suddenly afflicted with deafness. Though Mists was absent at that precise juncture, his loyal confederates were present. They observed, they comprehended, and they knew, with chilling certainty, that what had transpired was irrevocable. This was the royal decree, voiced publicly and solemnized by the sacred bond of the birthday pledge. Its weight surpassed any manacle ever forged. While the festivity continued outwardly, with melodies filling the air, wine flowing, and laughter serving its customary purpose, a separate set of directives commenced their clandestine journey through the palace's inner sanctums. Guards were dispatched to apprehend Mister's wife. She was escorted from her private chambers, wrenched from the sole sanctuary within the entire palace that she might have deemed secure. The specifics of her reaction upon the soldier's arrival remain unknown. Perhaps she demurred. Perhaps she presumed it a temporary measure, some administrative reassignment. Regardless of her conviction in that moment, the outcome was invariably the same. She was forcibly separated from any potential protector and delivered directly into Astras's absolute command. The queen had no intention of orchestrating a swift demise. Such an end would have been merciful, and mercy was far from her objective. In an ancient court, a dozen discrete avenues existed for the elimination of a rival. A subtle infusion of poison into one's sustenance, a conveniently timed misstep, a sudden ailment that raised no questions. The mistress desired none of these passive resolutions. She did not wish for this woman's mere disappearance. Her ambition was for her complete annihilation. Herodotus recounts the subsequent events, and even across millennia, his narrative stills the breath. The mistress had the woman restrained and then commanded her dismemberment, piece by agonizing piece. Her breasts, her nose, her ears, her lips, her tongue, all were severed. Every part of her anatomy that conveyed identity, that facilitated communication, that signaled femininity or social standing, was systematically removed. These excised fragments were not interred or disposed of with any semblance of respect. Instead, the mistress had them cast before the royal hounds to be devoured by animals, while the woman who had once carried herself with more grace than any other in the palace still drew breath. Contemplate the profound significance of this act within a court where appearance and vocal expression were paramount. For a noble woman, her visage served as her bulwark. Her pronouncements wielded her influence. Her bearing was her primary instrument of survival. The mistress did not merely inflict suffering, she surgically eradicated the very components of her victim's personhood. She transformed a living woman into an entity with whom the court could no longer engage as a fellow human. She became a spectacle to be gawked at, reviled, feared, but never again addressed as an equal. We shall not dwell on the visceral horror. The historical record speaks with sufficient clarity. What is crucial is the message the mistress was meticulously constructing through this atrocity. It was a proclamation aimed at every woman within the palace, at every man who might contemplate weaponizing his kin against the queen, at every individual who dared to covet what belonged to her and expect to emerge unscathed. Her message was not one of banishment. It was not a silent strangulation. It was a brutal reconstruction, a human form reshaped into a living testament to the grave consequences of defying the mistress. While this horrific tableau unfolded behind securely barred doors, Xerxes endeavored to manage the catastrophe he had set in motion. He was fully cognizant of his wife's capacity for ruthlessness. He understood that handing over Misty's wife was far from a simple courtly transaction. It was akin to igniting a conflagration within his own royal lineage. Perhaps he deluded himself into believing he could later contain the ensuing devastation. Or perhaps, at long last, guilt began to gnaw at the edges of his colossal ego. He summoned mists. In a separate chamber, removed from the sounds of unfolding torment, the two brothers convened. Xerxes presented what he evidently considered a reasonable proposition. He instructed Mists to repudiate his wife. As recompense, Xerxes offered him one of his own royal daughters as a replacement. Allow that to sink in for a moment. The very man who had taken Misty's daughter as his clandestine paramour was now proffering a different daughter as a mere consolation prize. It was as if women were interchangeable commodities to be manipulated and exchanged to settle his debts. Mists refused. At that point, he remained entirely oblivious to the horrific fate that had already befallen his wife. All he knew was that the king was exerting pressure upon him to abandon her. He would not comply. Herodotus records that Mists responded with unwavering resolve, declaring his steadfast allegiance to his wife without hesitation, enumerating her virtues and the years they had spent building a life together. He defended her with profound conviction and vigor. He was utterly unaware that the woman he was so valiantly defending had already been systematically dismantled under the queen's explicit orders, piece by agonizing piece, in a chamber not far from his own. Xerxes was consumed by fury. To be refused twice by members of the same familial circle was an affront his ego could not endure. Yet, even in his incandescent rage, he did not strike Mists down. The conversation concluded at that juncture. Mists departed, still operating under the conviction that his refusal had been sufficient, that kinship and loyalty still held intrinsic value within this empire. He proceeded back towards his domain, anticipating the reunion with the wife he had so passionately defended. What awaited him instead shattered the very foundations of his understanding. The woman who greeted him was no longer recognizable. The visage he had known intimately for years had vanished. The voice that had resonated beside him through decades of shared marriage was silenced. The body that had been a partner in his life had been reduced to a ruin by the queen's barbarity and the king's craven acquiescence. Every tenet Mists held regarding the limitations of royal authority, the significance of familial bonds, the security derived from being the king's own brother, all of it crumbled in that singular moment of devastating recognition. Something within him underwent a permanent and irreversible alteration. Mists gathered his sons. He possessed deep connections in the Eastern territories, particularly in Bactria, where his authority commanded genuine loyalty and he wielded sufficient influence to muster a fighting force. If he could reach that region, he might potentially assemble a contingent capable of challenging Xerxes, or at the very least, carve out a domain beyond the immediate grasp of the throne. It was a desperate gambit, a precarious hope. Yet, remaining within the palace meant awaiting utter annihilation at the king's next capricious whim. And Mists was done with waiting. He began making preparations for his departure. This was no discreet familial exodus. The king's brother, accompanied by his sons and his household guard, embarking eastward, could only signify one thing. The bonds of trust had been irrevocably severed. The court grasped this immediately. Mists was embarking on a path of open insurrection. The very empire that had once advanced as an indomitable phalanx into Greece was now fracturing internally, driven by the insatiable appetites of one man and the unyielding thirst for vengeance of one woman who would not suffer humiliation unanswered. News of Mist's movements reached Xerxes with remarkable celerity. The same intelligence network that had supplied the queen with palace gossip now furnished the king with crucial military information. A figure of Mist's stature could not vanish without a trace. Scouts meticulously tracked his trajectory. His eastward direction towards Bactria and the armies awaiting him was unmistakable. For Xerxes, this transcended a mere familial discord. It represented an existential threat. Should his brother reach allied territories and unfurl his banner, other disaffected nobles might rally to his cause. Greece had already demonstrated that the empire was not invincible. A civil war, compounded by that previous humiliation, could precipitate the dynasty's complete downfall. Consequently, Xerxes made his definitive decision. He dispatched soldiers with explicit orders to hunt down Mists and execute him. Not solely him, but his sons as well. Every male who harbored the potential to become a rival claimant, a symbol of betrayal, or a rallying point for rebellion. The man who had commodified human relationships within his private chambers now designated his own kin as targets on an open thoroughfare. And the assassins he dispatched were no ordinary legionaries. He commissioned the Immortals, the most feared elite soldiers of Persia. Before we follow these hunters into the searing dust and heat of the eastern routes, allow me to pause for a brief interlude. You are witnessing a narrative meticulously constructed from substantial, scholarly historical accounts that most individuals rarely encounter directly. For this particular episode, our chronicle has been firmly anchored in a singular, monumental work of academic scholarship focused on the Achaemenid Empire and the internal dynamics of Xerxes' court. That seminal book, the very bedrock upon which everything you have heard today is built, is currently accessible through the View Products button displayed on your screen. It is not intended for casual perusal. It is a profound, unwavering repository of power, brutality, and the intricate machinations of political maneuvering. However, if your aspiration is to truly comprehend the operational fabric of this civilization, beyond the oversimplified versions presented in your schooling, then this volume unequivocally belongs on your bookshelf. Furthermore, there is more awaiting your discovery behind that same button. In conjunction with that central tome, we have meticulously curated a collection of artifacts and themed items intrinsically linked to this historical epoch. I shall refrain from revealing the exact contents as the selection undergoes periodic rotation, but consider it a personal compendium of dark history. Immersive pieces and commemorative memorabilia are poised for your exploration. You will also find our official ancestral collection there, featuring essential works of dark history that you ought to possess. If you are the kind of individual who engages with videos like this from beginning to end, then that curated collection was specifically assembled with you in mind. Please feel free to open the virtual shelf, peruse the titles and artifacts at your leisure, and take your time as I conclude this unfolding narrative. For the path we embark on next leads into uncharted territory. Mistis and his sons are spurring their steeds eastward, pursuing the fragile hope that geographical distance might afford them sanctuary. Behind them, dust plumes are already beginning to rise. The Immortals are inexorably closing the gap with each passing hour, bearing a direct royal edict to obliterate an entire branch of the king's own bloodline from existence. Back within the palace walls, the ravaged form of Mistis' wife remains, a silent monument to the genesis of this catastrophic chain of events. Out on that desolate road, there will be no gilded ramparts, no courtly decorum, no more carefully calibrated words. Only the cold steel of weaponry, the grit of the unforgiving earth, and the ultimate, blood-soaked answer to the question that has been steadily building since the outset. To what extreme will Xerxes go to shield his throne from those who share his very lineage? The Immortals advanced with the precision of a single-minded mechanism. Their designated role within the empire had always been straightforward to articulate and terrifying to behold. They were the blade the monarch wielded against impediments he desired expunged. When one soldier fell, another instantly occupied the void, ensuring the unit's perpetual integrity. Now that blade, honed and disciplined, was not directed at a foreign legion. It was aimed at a royal procession fleeing eastward through the billowing dust. Mists and his progeny urged their mounts onward with relentless haste. They possessed an intimate familiarity with this terrain, surpassing that of most men whose lives had been confined to the opulence of palace corridors. The route to Bactria was arduous. Barren plains that fractured beneath the thunder of hooves, rocky outcrops that impeded the progress of chariots, air so thick with particulate matter that it seared the lungs. Behind them, the empire stretched like a predatory shadow. Mists was no romantic idealist chasing an ephemeral dream. He was a seasoned veteran, a man who had advised monarchs and led armies into battle. If he harbored the conviction that Bactria held allies prepared to stand with him, it was because he had diligently cultivated those alliances over many years. Yet none of that would matter if the Immortals apprehended him first. They relentlessly diminished the distance, employing a methodical patience. No impetuous charge, no reckless sprint. They maintained a calculated marching rhythm, pausing just long enough to sustain their deadly efficacy. Scouts ranged ahead, deciphering the telltale signs of hoofprints and wagon tracks imprinted upon the parched earth. There was no ambiguity regarding Mist's destination. A brother of the king could not simply vanish like a common fugitive. His flight represented a palpable wound inflicted upon the empire's surface, visible to all. At some point along that desolate route, perhaps near a constricted passage or a cluster of modest structures bleached white by the relentless sun, the two contingents finally converged. There was no parley, no offer of capitulation, no attempt to drag Mists back in shackles for a public adjudication. The royal orders were unambiguous, their intent absolute. Terminate the threat. In the ensuing violent confrontation, there was the clash of steel, the cacophony of shouts, and billowing clouds of pulverized earth. Mists and his sons were vastly outnumbered and ultimately overwhelmed. They met their end far removed from the gilded halls where this entire tragic saga had originated. Yet another branch of the royal bloodline was extinguished, not amidst marble splendor, but in the gritty soil of a roadside. The report, penned in the stark, formal vernacular of military dispatches, made its way back to Xerxes. The king had issued a directive. The directive had been executed. In bureaucratic parlance, the system had functioned flawlessly. A nascent rebellion had been quelled before it could even draw breath. The deceased were left where they fell, or interred without ceremony. No memorial was erected, no period of mourning observed. The matter could have been definitively closed at that juncture, filed away as yet another indispensable act of imperial governance. However, empires do not process information in the sterile manner suggested by official documentation. News disseminated along dual channels, through sealed communiques and via the hushed whispers of terrified servants. While individuals within the court did not possess every minute detail, they discerned the broad contours of the unfolding events. They understood that the king had permitted his queen to orchestrate the brutalization of his brother's wife. They knew that he had subsequently dispatched the Immortals to annihilate that same brother and his progeny. And they recognized that all of this had been precipitated by a clandestine liaison behind closed doors and a stolen robe draped ignominiously over a young girl's shoulders. The repercussions for the Persian aristocracy were akin to venom, slowly permeating the bloodstream. Many had initially perceived the mutilation of Misti's wife as an isolated act of royal cruelty, a savagery confined to the private sphere of the harem. However, the dispatching of the empire's most formidable soldiers to systematically annihilate the entire male lineage of a loyal brother, all stemming from a domestic catastrophe, represented something entirely different. It unequivocally demonstrated that the king's destructive impulses were not confined to the privacy of his chambers. They extended into the open, manifesting in armored figures on horseback. If Xerxes could inflict such brutality upon his own kin, then no one within the empire was beyond his reach. One individual who absorbed every facet of this unraveling was Artabanus. He was not a peripheral figure within the court. He held a position of considerable authority. Most historical accounts portray him as a powerful official and a distinguished military commander, deeply integrated into the palace's security apparatus. In certain traditions, he is identified as the same Artabanus who had previously voiced caution against the ill-fated invasion of Greece. Whether every historical connection attributed to him is precisely accurate, the overarching portrait remains consistent. He was a man who possessed a profound understanding of the mechanics of power and the vulnerabilities inherent within it. He observed the king's precipitous decline. He witnessed a ruler broken by the debacle in Greece, who had retreated into private obsessions, who had permitted his queen to transform the palace into a theatre of mutilation, and who had subsequently resolved the ensuing chaos by systematically eliminating his own brother's household. Such behavior was not indicative of a strong monarch. It was instability masquerading as sovereignty. For a man whose entire professional existence was dedicated to safeguarding the monarchy, the inescapable conclusion became increasingly apparent. The most significant threat to the throne no longer resided outside the palace walls. It was seated upon the throne itself. And it is at this juncture that the horror pivots its direction. Up to this point, all acts of violence had emanated from the king and queen, flowing downwards onto those subordinate to them. Now, a blade began to ascend, aimed directly at the man whom the entirety of the empire reverently referred to as the God King. Artabanus did not act in isolation. An assassination orchestrated within the most heavily fortified edifice on earth necessitated the collaboration of multiple individuals. He reached out to a select cadre of trusted associates, seasoned officers, palace insiders, individuals who shared his grave conviction that Xerxes was inexorably steering the empire towards an irreversible collapse, one that no military intervention could possibly avert. The plan they meticulously devised was as cold and calculated as any scheme orchestrated by the mistress herself. Xerxes harbored one glaring vulnerability. He possessed an unshakable belief in his impregnability, within the confines of his personal chambers. He slumbered, surrounded by men he deemed loyal, not by unknown assailants. Artabanus's elevated position granted him legitimate access to these innermost sanctums. If he were to transform this access into a weapon, he could penetrate a space that no foreign army had ever breached, the royal bedchamber itself. One fateful night, the conspirators enacted their plan. The palace at night possessed a hushed serenity compared to the daytime bustle, yet it was never entirely devoid of sound. Torches cast flickering, low-lying shadows in their sconces. Guards maintained their vigilant posts. Slaves, weary from their labors, slept huddled against the walls. Artabanes and his chosen confederates moved through these corridors under the guise of their inherent authority. They were not interlopers, they belonged. And it was precisely this belonging that rendered them so lethally effective. Those who already possess the keys are invariably the ones capable of unlocking the doors that ought to remain sealed. They reached Xerxes' chamber. The king, who had decreed mutilations with a single sentence and executions with a mere nod, now lay in the most vulnerable state any human can experience. Asleep, unarmed, trusting the edifice of loyalty surrounding him to provide an unbreachable defense. The precise sequence of subsequent events is somewhat obscured by the passage of centuries. Some accounts attribute the fatal blow directly to Artabanes. Others suggest he employed the services of a servant or a guard. The specific details may vary, but the central truth remains unaltered. The king, who had transformed his palace into a private abattoir, met his demise within that very palace, slain by the hands of men who had, until then, knelt before him in deference. No trumpets blared, no armies clashed upon the field of battle. The King of Kings met his end in a quiet chamber, in the darkness, at the hands of his own protectors. For a brief interval, measured in hours, perhaps days, the core of the empire was hollowed out, and only a select few were privy to this profound void. This ephemeral interlude presented Artabanes with his opportune moment. He moved with alacrity to consolidate his power, capitalizing on the assassination. The subsequent maneuver was even more strategically calculated. Xerxes was survived by his sons. The natural heir was Darius, the eldest. A younger son, Artaxerxes, occupied a less proximate position in the line of succession. Artabanes understood that should Darius ascend to the throne immediately, his inaugural act would undoubtedly be a thorough investigation, and such an inquiry would inexorably lead directly to the individuals whose hands were stained with blood. Therefore, Artabanes resolved to sever the next link in the chain before it could even be forged. He approached Artaxerxes. In certain historical renditions, he informed the young prince that Darius had orchestrated their father's murder. He meticulously constructed a narrative portraying a power-hungry elder brother who had assassinated the king to usurp the throne for himself. Artaxerxes, overcome by grief and still disoriented, believed this fabricated account. He was young, his entire existence confined to the world of the palace. The commander standing before him had always been presented as a paragon of unwavering loyalty and disciplined conduct. Why would a man of such standing fabricate a deception so monstrous? Under this manipulative influence, Artaxerxes turned against his own brother. The palace, already saturated with bloodshed, witnessed yet another royal killing. Darius, the legitimate heir according to traditional succession, was eliminated before he could claim his rightful inheritance. With Xerxes deceased within his chamber and Darius fallen beside him in the cascading sequence of violence, a path was cleared for Artaxerxes to assume the throne. He was guided at every step by the very individual who had masterfully engineered this entire chain of events. For a brief period, Artabanes operated as if the reins of the empire were firmly within his grasp. He had orchestrated the demise of the reigning king and neutralized the primary claimant to the throne. He had a young prince beside him, consumed by sorrow, whose survival and impending coronation were entirely dependent upon the general's intervention. On paper, Artabanus held an unparalleled degree of influence. From the shadows of the royal court, he wielded influence, shaping decrees, commanding the royal guard, and dictating the fate of those within the palace walls. His profound apprehension of Xerxes' erratic nature had transformed into a decisive and forceful consolidation of power. Yet, one individual remained outside his calculations. Queen Amistra, having endured the loss of her consort and one of her sons, was far from defeated. She had already proven herself possessed of a keen intellect, perfectly suited for such a treacherous environment. Sharp, deliberate, and precise. Her understanding of the palace's intricate web of communication and influence surpassed that of nearly anyone else. Though her title had been altered, her innate observational skills remained unchanged. She listened intently, discerning meaning in the pauses and silences. She observed those who appeared uneasy, those who spoke with undue haste, and those who deftly shifted the conversation when specific names arose. Gradually, a discernible pattern began to emerge from the surrounding cacophony. Amstress realized that the demises of Xerxes and Darius were not isolated misfortunes, but interconnected events. She understood that Artaxerxes had been manipulated, and that Artabanus, the very man entrusted with the security of the throne, was at the nexus of these machinations. In this profound realization, her own survival and that of her son became intrinsically aligned with the preservation of the dynasty. For years, she might have been a source of apprehension within the palace, but she was also the most resolute guardian of her own lineage. A trusted advisor, capable of orchestrating the demise of one monarch and implicating an heir, could undoubtedly repeat such an act whenever it suited his agenda. Consequently, she proceeded with extreme caution, reaching out to Artaxerxes. This likely occurred through private consultations or via trusted counselors whose unwavering loyalty to her remained steadfast. Regardless of the method, she managed to convey the truth, or at least enough of it, to him. She reminded him of those who stood to benefit from both deaths. She pointed out that Artabanus had been in close proximity to the king's chambers on the night of his assassination. She illuminated the obvious path, obscured by shock and grief, that had been hidden from him. Artaxerxes, though young, was not irrevocably deceived. His father had died under clandestine circumstances. His brother had been slain based on the testimony of a single individual. This same individual now stood constantly by his side, exhibiting an unsettling comfort amidst the turmoil and an unnerving preparedness with ready answers. Once planted, the seeds of doubt germinated rapidly. The prince's sorrow hardened into righteous indignation. Together, mother and son devised a retaliatory plan. They selected the throne room for their confrontation, intending for the very seat of royal authority to become the arena for justice. Artabanus entered the hall with the conviction that he still controlled the unfolding narrative, likely anticipating another day of subtle influence and continued guidance of the king he believed he had shaped. Instead, he walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. Before the assembled court, the atmosphere palpably shifted. Accusations were leveled. The narrative Artabanus had meticulously constructed began to unravel under direct scrutiny. Whether he vehemently denied the charges or attempted to shift blame was inconsequential. The royal guard, whose loyalty had been discreetly reoriented by the queen mother and her son, no longer responded to his commands. They awaited a signal from the throne, not from the captain. The signal was given. In a swift and decisive moment, the man who had orchestrated killings from the shadows found himself facing the sharp edge of retribution. Artabanus was apprehended. His accomplices, caught off guard, were swept up in his downfall. The very apparatus that had once executed his directives now turned against him, dismantling his authority. In the subsequent purge, Artabanus and his male relatives were summarily executed. The man who had presumed to manipulate the royal succession was himself excised from it. This event sent a clear and unmistakable message throughout the palace's every chamber. There could only be one fount of fear within those walls, not two. A queen mother had lost her husband and one son, but she had preserved another and secured his ascension to the throne. She emerged from the devastation not as a helpless widow in mourning, but as the powerful queen mother standing by the side of the new king, Xerxes I. When viewed in its entirety, the pattern of events is devastating. Xerxes treated human beings as mere objects for his personal gratification within his private sphere. Amstress, in turn, transformed human bodies into instruments of terror and warning. The brutal demise of Misty's wife and the extermination of his sons had rendered the royal household a mechanism of fear, where individuals were broken or discarded to appease the deep-seated insecurities of those in the highest positions of power. This destructive behavior did not remain confined to the palace grounds. It permeated the entire political structure. Artabanus absorbed this lesson and perpetuated it, employing clandestine violence to reorder the line of succession. Ultimately, Amstress turned this same weapon back upon him. By the time the dust settled, nearly all those who had instigated this catastrophe had met their end. Mists lay dead on a roadside in the east, his sons beside him. His wife, depending on which account one follows, either survived or succumbed to injuries that rendered her unrecognizable. In either scenario, the life she had known was irrevocably over. Xerxes rested in his tomb, felled not by foreign adversaries who had humiliated him at sea, but by the very men sworn to protect him in his sleep. Darius, the eldest son, was eliminated through the actions of a brother misled by treacherous intelligence. Artabanus and his entire family met their demise by the sword within the very palace he had once commanded. Who remained standing? The Queen Mother, still feared, still unpunished, still projecting her authority from behind her son's throne. Greek chroniclers would later immortalize her as the very embodiment of Persian barbarity, a nightmarish sovereign who dismembered women and reveled in the suffering of her adversaries. They depicted her as the malevolent entity lurking behind the regal facade. On one level, this portrayal is propaganda. Greek writers had every incentive to characterize Persia as a land of depravity and excess. However, on another level, even accounting for embellishment, they did not fabricate the core of the narrative. Events of this nature did occur. A woman was delivered to a queen and brutally dismembered. A royal brother was relentlessly pursued across the empire. A king was assassinated in his own bed. This is why the story warrants retelling. It exposes the consequences when power operates without any form of restraint. When a ruler treats every whim as a divine decree. When a queen believes every perceived insult must be avenged with bloodshed. When those entrusted with safeguarding the throne conclude that the sole means of preserving the empire is to assassinate its ruler. The Persian Empire did not crumble in a single day due to these events. However, it suffered a further internal decay. An empire that devours its own kin will ultimately prove unsustainable. And if one expands their perspective further, beyond the palace gates, past the desert thoroughfares, and across the centuries, a recurring pattern emerges across all civilizations that have concentrated excessive power in the hands of a select few. The instruments of terror that rulers fashion to subjugate others invariably end up being turned against them. Xerxes and Amstress sought to dominate their world by reducing individuals to mere objects, adornments, or dire warnings. Ultimately, the tables turned, and the palace they governed became the very stage for their betrayal, widowhood, and interment. The enduring image to retain is this: the halls of Susa, now hushed after the tempest. The air still heavy with the lingering echoes of screams and clandestine whispers. The throne now occupied by Arctic Xerxes, young yet permanently marked by the blood of his father and brother. Standing near him, the Queen Mother, alive when nearly all others are gone. The mutilated, the executed, the betrayed. None of them possess a voice any longer. She does. In this court, survival is the only tangible proof of power, and she possesses it. Generations later, when Greek historians seek an illustration of the darkness concealed within Persian opulence, they turn to her. They recount the tale of an unnamed wife, dismembered and fed to dogs, of a royal brother hunted across open plains, and of a divine king murdered in his slumber. Their intention is to shock their readership, and they succeed because the story is not a myth, but a chronicle of what transpires when unbridled desire, arrogance, and cruelty govern a household that dictates the fate of millions. If you have accompanied me to this final moment, you are part of a select group, those capable of confronting the full weight of such narratives without turning away. Thank you for watching until the conclusion. For those seeking further in-depth examinations of history's most somber episodes, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with anyone who still perceives ancient empires as merely marble structures and heroic conflicts. They need to witness the reality of the palace's inner workings. On your screen now, another documentary awaits, carefully chosen as your next step on this historical journey. Click it and continue exploring. If you have navigated this narrative, the subsequent one has been selected for you. You have just viewed another premium documentary from Ancestral, your definitive destination for historical exploration.